everyone, welcome to Spitfire SecDev. Today I'll be getting started my first tutorial series on Linux. In my previous two videos, we set up a home lab in VirtualBox that contained two Linux machines, Linux Mint and Kali. Both of those machines are going to be used for the rest of this course, and before we can start doing anything like programming or hacking, we first need to understand how they work. Linux is very similar to Windows and Mac OS, where you can open files, use a web browser, watch videos, play music. Linux is arguably one of the most popular operating systems out there for hackers and programmers. So today I'm going to be releasing my first video on how to figure out what is on your Linux machine. When we downloaded Linux Mint, we ran all those upgrades. Where do all those files get saved? How do I run programs? How do I install new programs? And really just going to get an understanding of how to use our operating system. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to show you as you open up Linux Mint is how the folders and files are all organized. So we navigate here to our home folder, and you'll see things like your desktop, documents, downloads. However, we click this back arrow up here, and we see home. We'll see one folder for SecDev, that's me as a user. If we go up one more, this is what's called the root folder. Now, every file that you have on your Linux machine is going to be in one of these folders. So I'm going to go through each one and just give a very brief overview of what each folder contains. So in the bin folder, you'll see a lot of files. The bin folder is going to have a lot of the programs that your computer runs. Either you are able to access it through some sort of menu item, or on the command line you'd be able to run one of these commands. Next is boot. This contains all the files that are used during the initial boot up process. You don't really want to touch anything in here unless you absolutely know what you're doing, because you would break basically how your computer turns on. So I would recommend not touching anything in there. Cd-Rom is your Cd-Rom folder. Naturally it's empty because we don't have any sort of CDs in there. The dev folder. This contains a lot of stuff related to your disk. Anything that is to do with your hard drives, your storage, lives in here. The next folder is the etc folder. This is short for etc. and really just contains any configuration files that don't belong in something like a library or another folder. This is universal across the system, so if there's one application that wants to work the same way across users, there's nothing user specific, then those go in here. Home folder we've already gone over. This contains all of the different folders for different users. So if you ever want to find user files, you would just navigate between the various subdirectories in the home folder. Lib is short for library. This contains all of the files that executables in the bin directory, along with other executables across the system, need in order to run. So really just a lot of external libraries that are referenced across the system. Media, this is going to be your external hard drives, your CD-ROMs, anything that needs to plug into the system. The mount folder, or MNT for short, is things that are temporarily mounted onto the file system. If I want to, say, download a hard drive, from the internet, it's packaged up as a, disk file, I can then mount that file into the mount folder, and then I'd be able to read it as if it were a normal file system. So we'll probably do something like that in the future, where there's a packet capture, or there's some sort of forensics related challenge where we would need to mount a file in order to study its contents before we can look at it. This is where you do that, is you mount everything in the mount folder. Opt, these are optional third-party software that's installed. If you download something like Google Chrome for Linux, it's going to be installed inside of the opt folder. The next folder is proc. This contains all your processes, anything that is being managed by the system in the background. All of those files are being created and destroyed if you have a process. We can look real quick. These are all numbered based on a process ID. Root, this is the folder for the root user. Now on Windows you have your standard local administrator. Whenever you want to run something as a privileged user, you do the run as administrator. In Mac OS you have to type in your password before you're able to install something, and it depends on whether or not you're allowed, if you're an administrative user or a standard user. In Linux, there's this concept of root, and root is the user that has access to everything. They can do whatever they want. And so in a little bit, we'll get into some more detail about how the Linux permission model revolves around root. Really just know that anything root goes on in here. Run. So this is a pretty new concept for Linux where any temporary runtime related files, whether it be configurations or just anything temporary, goes in here. It used to be split up into different areas like your temp folder, your sys folder. It used to be split up in a couple different areas. Now a lot of more modern Linux distributions are placing things in the run folder, and that's just where things live temporarily. So I don't know too much about run yet. I haven't had to delve into it too much. I just know that it's getting utilized more and more for temporary files and other stuff. sbin, very similar to bin. It's where your executables are. Serve, I'm actually not too sure what serve's for. I think it's not getting used that much anymore. I've never had to mess with it. Sys, this is typically what is used by the kernel. So what you typically think of as the operating system, everything going on between the hardware and the software, whatever, determines how all that works in the background. Sys has the files for that. So you see stuff like bus, class, devices, firmware, kernel, module, all those words. Tells you that it's a lot of low-level stuff. So that's where all that work happens. Temp, temporary. This is a temporary drive. When you reboot, most of the files in there are going to go away or be changed or something. So don't put anything you want to keep in here. Temporary. Temp is a temporary folder. User. Now, this is also a pretty important folder, sort of like home, where anything that you install, either through some sort of package manager or from the internet, it's most likely going to be getting installed to the user folder. There's a bunch of subfolders. Local is a big one, and then bin and sbin. You can think of these in the same way you think of, the bin and sbin up here. So just think of user as a place that user-specific executables, programs, different things get placed. And the last folder we have is var. This is where a lot of things you typically would consider on when you first install an operating system, you have, your email, your web, different services that you can either host or, access on a computer. That's where these live. So if I want to host a web server, all of the files that then get exposed to the internet, they're going to be stored in var, and then there's going to be a www folder. Likewise for mail, if I have some sort of mail client or mail server on my computer, it's going to go in this mail folder here. You also have all your log files. So as the system does stuff, there's going to be log files that are saved so that if things break or you need to figure out why something is working the way it is, you can look in these various log files and see what's going on. All right, so that covers the way that the file system is set up. I've gone ahead and opened up the terminal, which you can find on the bottom left, and I'm going to type ls. ls stands for list files, and another thing we can do is ls-l. Now the dash is what's called a flag, and flags allow you to pass additional parameters to the command, and depending on the flags that you pass, it'll do different things. So all I've done is I've enabled L to basically long mode, that's what I call it. And it kind of just shows you the permissions, the user, the group, how big it is. By default, all folders are 4096, and then the last time it was modified. We can go ahead and also do ls-al, and you'll see that I have multiple letters or flags after one of these dashes. If a flag takes arguments, then you can't do this. Like if A was to take, an argument, and then L was to take an argument, you'd have to do it like this. But since neither of these take arguments, we can all group them under one dash. So if I do ls-al, you'll see that it includes files that have a dot in front of them. By default, any file or folder with a period in front of it is what's called a hidden file or hidden folder, and so it won't show up by default. If we open up the Files Explorer you'll see the same thing. We can right click and click on show hidden files, and it's the equivalent of enabling the TAC-A flag. So I'm going to turn off hidden files. So that's how you actually view your files. You can either do it through this window and navigate around, or you can use the command line. I prefer the command line because it's a lot faster once you get used to it. An example of this is, let's say we go up, press the back arrow, you'll see home, which is your standard home directory. And so as we navigate around, we might want to move a file from, say, temp, mint update. I'm just choosing a random file. Let's say we want to move this file to documents, and then I create a folder, and then I create a folder within that folder, and I want to move it 2 or 3 folders deep. Well, you could either copy it and then navigate through and paste it, or I can simply use the cp command, and I know that it lives in the temp folder, and then I can use tab, press the tab twice, it'll show me all the options. I type mint, tab, tab again, and you'll see by default it tab completes my command. So that makes it really fast. I just did all that navigation with 4 or 5 key presses. Now I want to copy this file /temp /mint update /z whatever to my documents folder, and let's say I have multiple folders. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make that pretend folder with the make dir command. This stands for make directory. So I'm going to make dir home, tab complete secdev, press tab twice. We'll see documents, and we'll see that there's nothing in documents. So we're going to make the directory test1. So now let's look and see what directory we're in. The way that we look and see what directory we're in is the pwd command, which stands for present working directory. If we press enter, we see that we're currently in /home/secdev. We just made a directory in /home secdev documents test1. So if we want to change directories from secdev to documents, either do cd /home/secdev documents, or it knows that we're currently in this directory. So why don't we just type documents? If we type present working directory, we'll see that we're now there. Also, what we see is that after this squiggly, the documents word got appended to it. This squiggly, I think it's called a tilde. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. It stands for your home directory. If I were to cd and then type squiggly, you'll see we'll go there. And it's basically the equivalent of the home secdev folder. This is going to be different, obviously, depending on which user you are. If I was, not the secdev user currently, if I was, John, then /home/John would be the equivalent to this, tilde. So that's really convenient that we can always go to our home folder simply by typing cd and then a squiggly line. All right, so now my screen's blank. What I just ran is the clear command. Clear clears your screen. If I was to do, a bunch of stuff that doesn't really work, and I clog up my screen, I can just type clear, and it'll clear everything back. Now let's say I want to run a command that I did previously, and now I can't find it and copy and paste it. If I just do history, it'll print out a history of all the commands I've run. If I want to run a command that I've previously run, I do ! and then whatever the number is. So let's say I want to run ls-tac-al, but I don't want to type that out again. I can just do ! 20, and we just ran ls-tac-al again. So that's the basics of just navigating around your file system on the command line. So now that we can move around our different files and move files around and just see where everything is, the next thing we want to be able to do is actually execute programs. So I've created a file called happy.sh that all it does is print out happy with ! The way that we can run this command is first, let's check and see what its permissions are. This first column right here is the permissions for the different files that are on your system. We have an R, we have a W, and then some of these have an X. A dash means that it's not one of the permissions we have. You'll see that this RWX sequence repeats 3 times. The first column is what the owner of that file or folder can do. In this case, everything in our home folder is owned by us. The second column is group, whoever belongs to the group that this file belongs to. So secdev is the group name as well. And then the third column is other. So anyone that's not either the user or in that group, what their permissions are. So you'll see, for example, that so this file that I made, I can read it, I can write to it, but I can't execute. Anyone that I add to my group can also do those things, and then everyone else can just read it, but they can't actually make any changes. But nobody can execute it, and so that makes it kind of pointless because this is I want to be able to execute this in order to print out happy. So the way that you change permissions for any file on a Linux machine is chmod. Now, chmod has a couple different ways that you can pass arguments to it. The simplest way that I'm going to show you right now, just to change one of these things, and it's going to make the changes for everyone, is just doing plus and then either A for everything, X for executable, W for writable, or R for readable. So I'm going to do chmod plus X and then happy.sh. So chmod plus X happy.sh. What that means is it change the modifiers, change the permissions to add the ability to execute that file for happy.sh. So we run that, and then in order to actually run the file, and I'll prove to you that works, ls tac l again, we'll see that now this X modifier has been added for everybody, and now this is green. That's just a way that the command line likes to color stuff. You now see that everything is able to be, anybody who accesses this file can execute it. Doesn't matter if they're me, in my group, or anyone else. So actually to execute the file, all we have to do is basically type out the file name. Now, if the file is currently in the directory that you're working in, you need to use / and then the file name. So we'll do /happy.sh, prints out happy, cool, it works. However, let's say we're not in the same directory. If I do ls, we're one directory above. What I just did with the cd ... is move one directory up. The cd ... command doesn't do anything because a single period represents the current directory we're in. 2 periods represent our parent. So when we were in home/secdev, our parent was home, and then the parent of home is the root directory. So if I was to do cd ... again, when I'm currently in the home directory, I'm now in the root directory, and this is where all the files on your system live. To navigate back down this tree, we do cd home/secdev, and we're back in our home folder. So we ran, so I'm going to do cd ... again to go back up, and rather than doing /, we don't need to do that anymore. All we need to do is type the name of the file itself. So I'm going to do dev/happy, and it prints out happy. So you only need to do the / if it's in your current directory. If it's anywhere else, you can just type the name of the file path directly. So that's the basics of running commands on the command line. Most stuff that you're going to be wanting to do at the start, just to get comfortable with Linux, is going to be down here in the menu. This is where all of your programs live, and you can access most things that you expect, like your web browser, mail, image viewer. You even have your own sort of version of Microsoft Office called LibreOffice. It's the Linux version of Microsoft Office. So all those files and different programs exist in the menu. The reason I showed you the command line to start is that a lot of guides out there, when you start going through Linux, assume that you're comfortable on the command line. And you definitely are going to be getting pretty comfortable using the command line in these tutorial series. I'm just showing you the very basics of looking at files in your directory, moving up and down the tree where all the files are stored, creating files, stuff like that. So the next thing that I want to show you on the command line is how to install new packages. Now, you could also utilize the software manager that comes with Linux Mint. You can find that down here in Administration and then Software Manager. But in my opinion, the search functionality and kind of just takes a little while for searches and installations and all that stuff to be found. Using the command line, in my opinion, gives you a lot more control over what packages you want to install, which versions, and you can see, if something fails, you'll be able to see why it failed rather than it just not working. The first thing that we need to understand before we can install packages is how permissions work in Linux. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. I'll probably devote an entire video to Linux permissions. I've touched on a little bit with the whole read, write, execute thing. Now I'm going to get into users. So every single Linux system that I know of has a user called root, and root can control everything. Root is the administrator. He has full control over everything. On my previous video where we installed Kali Linux, you'll recall that we made a password for the root user and we logged in as root. Linux Mint does not use the root user by default. You create your own normal user who is then able to access root functionality temporarily for certain operations. And the command to access root permissions and be the root user for temporary operations is the sudo command. And the sudo command, basically, for one, it's only certain users can use it. The way that we can check to see if we can use sudo is we just type in groups, and you'll see that we belong to the sudo group. Secdev, these are all the different groups that secdev, my user, belongs to. Sudo is one of the groups. You have to belong to that group in order to use the sudo command. And what sudo gives us is the ability to basically be root and do things that require elevated privilege. But then as soon as that command finishes, we get set back down to our standard permissions. So that's a really good thing for security, because if a lot of the things that I do require root user, then most people will just either A, use root all the time, which is bad because if you get any sort of malicious software that you use or anything that is able to gain control of your computer, any sort of bad program you install, if you're the root user while that happens, then that means that program is going to be able to do anything at once as well. It's generally good security practice not to be root when you're on your computer. It's better to create another user, give that user access to the sudo command by adding them to the sudo group, and then whenever they need to do something as root, they just run the sudo command and then whatever they want. So you can prepend sudo to whatever you want. We could do sudo ls. It'll ask me for my password, and it does the same thing. If we type ls/root, we'll see that we have permission denied because only the root user can look and see what's in the root directory. If we do sudo ls/root, we'll see that it prints out nothing, but it didn't print out an error. That's because the root directory doesn't have anything in it because the root user hasn't really been, it exists, but it doesn't really exist. We can't log in as root on this computer. So the first way we're going to use sudo to do things as root is by installing packages. If anyone's used Python before, you know that there is something called pip, which is kind of the package manager for Python. If I want to install different things for Python that don't exist in the Python standard library, what comes with Python by default, there are extra things that other people in the Python community write that gives you additional functionality. They write code and libraries and other stuff that you can use. Well, there's a way that we got to be able to install those libraries on our system. And most people use the pip manager to do that. So let's go ahead and install pip for our Linux Mint machine. The first thing we do is we type sudo, because any sort of installation like this is going to require additional privileges. After we type sudo, we type apt-get. I'll get into what this means in a little bit. Space install, space Python -pip. Now if I press the tab key twice, you'll see that, we got a couple options. Do this one, and we type enter. Now it didn't ask me for my password because I've used sudo recently enough and typed my password into sudo recently enough that for, I think the default is 6 minutes, or it might be a little bit less. By default, after I type my password in the first time, I can use sudo for 5 or 6 minutes without my password. So that's nice. We would type yes and install pip, and go ahead and install that. But I'm not going to do that right now. If we were to try to run this command without sudo, it'll say, could not open lock file, unable to lock the admin directory, are you root? Well, we're not root, but we also weren't really root up here either. Like, it still says secdev and all that, but the sudo command basically temporarily gives us root and then runs this command. And so the package manager thought we were root when we ran this, but in reality we weren't. So sudo is just a really great thing for Linux. Anyone that uses Linux knows that you should use sudo for all your administrative, any changes you make to your system that require extra privilege, you use sudo. So that'll be it about sudo. I know I've taken a little time on it, but I know that if you're new to Linux, that whole permissions and being able to install stuff that you want, might find the whole permissions model and having different permissions for different users, besides just your standard, right-click, run as administrator, or when you run something, that little pop-up box pops up on Windows that says, you need administrator privilege to do this, yes or no. That's kind of how Windows does things. You give it the same temporary permissions. For Linux, it's a little, I guess, more complicated, but you can kind of think of them the same way. So that's how you are able to install things on your system and use the sudo command. Alright, so that does it for my first intro to Linux video. Hopefully that wasn't too much to take in. In the description, I've posted a document that contains some more commands that you'll find useful as you start to learn and get a good feel for how the command line works. Definitely take some time to practice what I've given you. If you use to something like Python, you've done some programming in the past, learn how to install those tools on Linux and start getting a feel for just Linux Mint. We're going to be using that for the rest of these few Linux videos. So stay tuned. This is Spitfire SecDev.